Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.
It's dependencies in some form or fashion at the end of the day that get in the way.
Who is Mike Cottmeyer and what's been your journey?
Okay, well, that's a big question, man. So who is Mike Cottmeyer? Well, okay, we'll take it from a professional angle. So I'm the CEO of a company called Leading Agile. Started it about 11 years ago. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia. We've gotten pretty big over the last couple of years. We're about 160, almost to 170 people. We focus almost exclusively on Agile transformation, more often than not in kind of either the IT product development space or IT services space. We like to consider ourselves kind of a full stack consultancy in the sense that, obviously you have to deal with the work surface levels and what the teams are doing, but, how do you orchestrate teams across dependency boundaries? How do you go up into portfolio management? How do you go up into investment management, that kind of a thing? What do you do with audit and compliance? What do you do with planning cadences? What do you do with enterprise architecture? Like the whole thing, right? So like what we really do is, I like to think of us as like we kind of refactor organizations to be able to operate with more business agility, right? In a nutshell. Yeah. And then aside from that, I'm a dad, a husband, I have 3 boys, so it's basically family and work for the most part. For me.
Yeah. You got a lot of guitars in this. Are those guitars in the background?
I do. I play guitar. So I actually, as soon as I said that, I went, well, it's not 100% true. I ski a lot and I play guitar and I do jujitsu. And I've been kind of on a bit of a fitness journey for the last couple of years as well. So yeah, but the hobbies all kind of vary. Guitars have been persistent in my life since I was about 12 years old. So yeah.
Nice. How did you get into this Agile space? You said you've been doing, in this 11 years, but I'm sure it's more than that. Like, how did you end up?
Well, back in the early 2000s, I guess, I spent the first 10 years of my career mostly in IT infrastructure. So like literally like 19 to about like 30 or so. Mm-hmm. And then, so I guess 30 put us in the early 2000s and, the manifesto had just been written. And I was working as a project manager in a company called CheckFree here in Atlanta, and squarely like in the PMO. But I had always kind of adapted practices, project management practices to deal with variation, because like my worldview was that things were not as certain as the Gantt chart implied, kind of a deal. And so I was working on this company called CheckFree in the PMO, doing PMI style project management. And I was working with development teams. And there was a guy who's on my team now named Brian Sondergaard, who I work for. And we were going back and forth on some things. And so I inquired, like, what do you guys, like, tell me, what are you guys formally doing? And they were doing, they said it was extreme programming at the time, but what they were really doing was like Scrum with some technical practices and things like that. They were more aligned, it felt like to me, with Scrum. And so I built a relationship with this dev director that I was working with, and he and I would collaborate, and I was reading books and, reading all the Kent Beck stuff and the early Kent Schwaber stuff. There's still a lot of guys writing kind of in the RUP space and scaled project management space, agile project management space, that time, Jim Highsmith, right, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then, so the same guy, Brian Sondergaard, I ended up coming in working for him in his dev organization. And we just started doing some really cool stuff with Agile program and portfolio management. We were inventing a lot of things, taking David Anderson's work on Kanban and the Agile management stuff that he was doing, and literally building like what you would recognize now as like early versions of SAFe, tiered frameworks and like flow-based management systems at the higher tiers. And so it was that for a couple of years, that group reorganized, and I kind of found myself back in a regular PMO. And I'm like, that's not cool, right? And at that point, I had, no disrespect to PMOs out there, but it's like that we had done so much cool stuff, like I just couldn't go backwards, right?
Yeah.
And then so I ended up going to work for version 1 for a little bit, and that was like my first introductory to like a pure play Agile organization. And I was on the team that went in and trained and consulted And what was super cool about that was, and I know a lot of practitioners are listening to this will recognize it, when you have a tool, the tools are typically designed to work in an agile way. And if you're working with an organization that's not really structured for agility, like you start to recognize there's a lot of stuff that's broken, and you have kind of two choices. You either change the tool to accommodate the organization, or you change the organization. And unfortunately, most of the companies that we were dealing with, again, I didn't have agency or influence to change the organization. But I started writing a lot about what I would do. And I started doing talks about what I do. And the cool thing about version 1 is like any talk, any conference I could get accepted to, they would let me go speak. And I was off speaking all the time, right? Yeah. So going to conferences, building networks, meeting with people. I got to meet, people who are like my heroes, like Jim Highsmith and Alistair Coburn and Christopher Avery and Joshua Karievsky and, Kent Beck and like all these guys, right? And was fortunate to become friends with some of them through the years, right? Which is pretty cool. You get to become friends with your heroes a little bit, right? So literally standing on the shoulders of giants. Left out Mike Cohn, never really became friends with him, but guys, Esther Derby, just all those luminaries of our field, and just consumed everything, right? And I was just writing and speaking and stuff, and then kind of went and joined a company called Pillar Technology for about a year. Ended up not being a great move for me personally, but great company. They're fine. They sold to Accenture, I think. And then 11 years ago, launched Leading Agile. And stated goal is I wanted to double my salary and work part-time. And I joke that I failed miserably. Over 11 years, became a CEO and learned a ton about stuff I'd never want to learn about, like banking and payroll and benefits and investment strategies and growth and SG&A and cost of goods sold and all kinds of stuff. So trying to keep the company as agile as it can possibly be. So like we try super hard to organize in ways very similar to how we ask our customers to organize and to manage their processes, empower their people, and distribute decision making, and try not to be super command and control, and that kind of a thing. So we try to do what we say to do, right? And we try to be
that is awesome. And I think for obviously I know Dave prior, and I've known other people that worked, and it's from Leading Agile, at least what I've heard people that worked for Leading Agile, and like the way that you engage with your clients is focus more on coaching, focus more on meeting people where they are in companies. And I wanted to kind of go back to something that you mentioned, which is you said you refactor organizations. And I want to go to a topic. I haven't discussed this with anybody on the podcast, and I've done business architecture. And I want to start there, and then we can kind of go down. But from your perspective, and you said something that's related to this, you said if your systems and capabilities are not aligned to your products and customers, your practices don't matter. So I want to come back to that, but could you just maybe, for those that are not familiar with what business architecture is, could you maybe just describe it?
Well, so we're in an interesting phase of Leading Agile where we have people that are deep experts in things that I'm not deep experts in. And so like Dennis Stevens, who was one of my early like co-founder kind of people, deep expertise in business architecture. I kind of think I'm just kind of a business architecture hobbyist, right? but in principle, right? In principle, what we're talking about with business architecture is we look at the organization not through the lens of what the people do or what their function is, but more through the lens of what are the services that the business provides. And so like the analogy I use, the reason why I talk about refactoring is because I think there's like a really strong metaphor here. It's like when you take like a legacy monolith and you want to like move it to the cloud or do DevOps or something like that, right? You can't pull the whole monolith up and put it in the cloud, right? What you end up doing is you end up pulling out services, and you end up encapsulating services, and you put encapsulated services, service boundaries and contracts and all those things. You move that to the cloud, right? Kind of a thing. And that's what a lot of organizations are like, but it's people and structures and processes and org design and things like that. And so when we do an early stage transformation, I actually don't bring typically Agile coaches. I mean, everybody's like very familiar with Agile and Scrum and things like that, but I wouldn't call them Agile coaches per se. We typically do an early stage, like a startup engagement with a business architect and somebody who's like really like a product person, but probably a little different than most people would think. Like, so we go in and we'll literally do like business capability models, heat maps of the organization.
And I'm assuming this is somebody like pretty high up, like COO, like, because those are the people that have usually authority to make these type of changes, right? Or is it somebody like
yeah. Well, that's probably an interesting angle, right? So one of the things that I talk about as a company and just from us is we have to be incredibly patient in our sales cycle because like it all comes down to span of control. And so, so if you're dealing with like a division, right, it might be like a division head, it could be a divisional CIO or a senior vice president or vice president that's working with a business partner on that side, and they have span of control over like a piece of the organization. But yeah, absolutely, right, the kinds of changes that you have to make have to be sponsored at the top because they're not process changes. Process is part of it, but like you literally have to create a hypothesis organizationally for what you're going to group people around, right? And so let me take it from the other side. Like one of the, like I did a talk for the Scrum Gathering in Vegas. It had to have been 8-9 years ago at this point, but I did this talk called The Three Things, and it was like the 3 things you need to know to transform any organization. And the 3 things were just really simple: teams, backlogs, working tests, and software. And the way Scrum works, right? We know this, right? The way Scrum works is you have to have a dedicated team of people that own the product, that are interfacing with like a product owner who's responsible for the backlog, and they have to have the ability to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint. Like period, hard stop, right? Exactly. And if you don't have those conditions, then what starts to happen, right, is you get teams that are breaking the rules of Scrum because they kind of have to, right? And so like at the lowest level of the organization, you have to ask yourself is what is necessary to form a complete cross-functional team that stays together over time. And what it comes down to is that you have to have a capability or a feature set or an encapsulated service with technology boundaries, a dedicated team, a service owner or a product owner, and you have to have the deployment capabilities to produce a working tested increment at the end of every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's just true, right? So you can either kind of take the Scrum approach that says, okay, well, we're going to start doing Scrum, and then your impediments will reveal themselves, and the impediments will get resolved by the Scrum Master. But in practice, right, that's too low level to address these systematic issues.
Exactly. Because I think what happens is like the dependencies are exposed, and you start seeing all of a sudden all of these dependencies, you still have delivery issues, right?
For sure, right? For sure. And that's really, so you hit the nail on the head, right? It's like, it's dependencies in some form or fashion at the end of the day, they get in the way. Because the Scrum, and this is where SAFe comes in. It's kind of interesting, right? So what Scrum came along and said was, okay, we're going to encapsulate the dependencies inside the team, and we're going to give the team agency to how to resolve those dependencies in real time. That assumes that the dependencies are encapsulated within the team. So now when you have multiple Scrum teams that have dependencies between them, right? What SAFe came along and basically said was, well, I'm going to encapsulate the value stream, and we're gonna put the boundaries of the dependencies between teams within like a release train or a value stream, or put big room planning around it, and we're going to do string between things, and we're going to do that stuff, right? What we find is really complex organizations, the value streams are not really encapsulated very well either.
Exactly.
Right. So what do you do with dependencies between value streams? Right. Now, the Les guys, right, Bosfeld and Craig Larman, I think they've actually got the model right. It's like you've got to break the dependencies and you've got to put the right technical architecture in and stuff. But the challenge is that can take years in some of these organizations, right? That's not a flip of the switch. Even if you wanted to fund it, you couldn't do it overnight. You couldn't do it safely, quickly.
Exactly.
Right? It takes a minute, right? And
but it
so
also takes people. Like I think maybe another, it takes a lot of people to understand what needs to happen. And maybe just to kind of add another thing here, which is reference architecture. So we talked about business architecture. Business architecture, just to keep it simple, it has to do with organizational design, policies. Essentially, how do you architect your organization? Right? Like, what about where does reference architecture, and we're not talking IT reference architecture, but business reference architecture fit in? And what is your...
Well, let me tell you the way I usually use that word, right? So there are organizational patterns that I think are universally true, right? And I think SAFe and LESS, and maybe some other things like discipline, agile delivery, some of the stuff that like Al Shalloway's done with net objectives, and I guess now he's part of PMI. A lot of what those people have built upon are really sound foundational principles, like encapsulated teams at the work surface level, Kanban or flow-based kind of governance models on top, right? Lean, agile metrics that enable us to measure improvement, things like that. And so I think there's like a reference architecture to organizational design that I believe is true. And I think it's...
But those are more like patterns, right? Like they're taking a bunch of, patterns and just putting them together and creating all of these frameworks around.
Yeah. So that's, well, that's where I was going, right? And so like, that's the reason why I preface it. This is how I use the word reference architecture, right? It's like those base patterns, the base structures, the rules of operation, just the things that we just know to be inherently true. It might be like a design pattern, like if you read a design patterns book in code, right? And I'm not a coder, so I can't rattle a bunch of stuff off, but like those design patterns are universally true. And then they get implemented in an organization, right? And then all of those patterns get instantiated into an operating model for that organization. And this is my challenge with LESS and Scrum and some of these other things, is I think all of them are built on incredibly sound reference architecture, but they're overly specific in their reference implementation.
Correct. So essentially, they're instead of dealing with complexity, where like instead of the reference architecture being fixed, which SAFe has a picture and all of these, instead of like leveraging those patterns and almost evolving that architecture, so that architecture has to be emergent rather than fixed. Right.
Well, so Dean has like a couple of for what he's trying to build, right? The challenge with kind of going down the path that we go down is that it's really difficult to scale, right? The fact that I'm at 160, 170 people is mind-blowing to me, right? Because it's really tough, right? But like what Dean kind of, and at least this is my understanding from the outside of that organization, what they've really done is they've packaged a reference implementation that basically gives people guidance. It's a little bit like the RUP days, where it's like, these are practices that are good for most people most of the time. We fully expect you to tailor them, right? But the certification is around the implementation details. And, like most people, even with Scrum, it's like you go to a certification class and it isn't good practices that most people can do most of the time. It's like, this is SAFe, right? And we don't tailor very well. We didn't tailor RUP, we're not tailoring SAFe, right? And so even if we do tailor, then sometimes we make bad tailoring decisions and it causes the system to break and all that kind of stuff, right? And so because Dean is trying to create certification, right, he's codified all this stuff, right? And it's a thing, and it has release numbers and all these different things. More power to him, right? I mean, there's good guidance in there, and we work with SAFe shops all the time, right? But it's like, I mean, Dean knows, right? I've had conversations one-on-one with Dean, is that he knows that there's an underlying organizational architecture required to support this. It's just, last I talked with him, it's beyond the scope of what he's trying to certify.
No, I mean, I spoke to him on this podcast too, and I asked him about that specifically, and he's like, like you said, it can be if you have somebody that doesn't know what they're doing, of course they're gonna, and he is saying that those are patterns, but.
And he'll come in and consult for you and customize the model for you and do all those things, right? So again, I think it's high integrity, but just like everything, right, in life, it's like we take the surface level stuff, and the biggest problem we see in the transformation space right now is you're taking a reference implementation, overlaying on top of an organizational design that it wasn't meant for, and it doesn't work. or it doesn't work as effectively as we would like it to.
And that's why it fails in a sense. A lot of times, so maybe to tie this together, like, what we've been saying, or what I wanted you to kind of expand on is like, okay, organizational architecture is key. You have to have somebody on the business side, usually supported by the board, to make a decision that we have to look at the whole organization and how it's architected, right?
Yeah.
And then when we look at the architecture, we have to understand that in order to deal with this type of organization, the architecture can't be fixed. It has to be contextualized to our own organization, rather than just relying on a recipe, like treating SAFe or any other framework like a recipe. And then even though we don't have half of the ingredients, we're saying, oh, let's do SAFe. Right.
Yeah. Well, so sure. Right. So like the process. So like one of the things that we've been unpacking for the last couple of years is we talk about the difference between like a system of delivery, right, that consists of reference architecture patterns and reference implementation details. Mm-hmm. And then there's a system of transformation. Okay, how are you going to implement it? Mm-hmm. There's a third system, which is we call system of continuous improvement, which is how are you going to sustain it and continuously adapt it? And then, this is something that maybe, a company wouldn't put in, but we call it a system of engagement. But it's like, how are we going to start to build mind share over time to get the organization to converge into these patterns? And so a lot of the process for us is getting everybody aligned around the reference architecture patterns, picking a slice of the organization that wants to go and do this, call it an expedition, and then we move it to a defined steady state. And for us, a lot of times and this is another thing that I think is hard for people to get over. I was literally just talking with some of our developers this morning, and it's like sometimes in an early stage transformation, in the presence of dependencies, when things are not aligned as well as we would like them to, sometimes we have to put in compensating controls. And we use the metaphor like scaffolding. I want to build a wall, and I don't want the wall to have a bunch of metal stuff around it. But while I'm building it, and it's hardening, I have to put some scaffolding around it. So there's a lot of things that we do in an early stage, depending on the organization, that might be heavier than SAFe. As much grief as SAFe gets for being heavy, we'll do things that are heavier than SAFe because they're scaffolding. And then as we improve the systems underneath through our system of transformation, then you can start to dismantle the scaffolding.
And it's almost, I think I heard you talk, maybe you can expand on it here, like most of the organizations today, larger organizations, are structured around capabilities. And a lot of times you might have to start with those capabilities and move them into value streams over time, rather than just quickly trying to organize by value streams. And
so there's an interesting journey that we're starting to uncover, especially if we've been fortunate to work with some really, really large clients. And what you find is that there's a sequence to events that like A has to be true before B can be true, before C can be true. And so a lot of times you'll walk in and people aren't even organized around business capabilities. They're organized around functional silos, and there's project management that's stitching together processes and resources and things like that, right? So again, all this depends upon the complexity of the organization and the size of the organization. Like if you can walk in and you can reorganize around products or feature sets and they're discrete and that's awesome, right? I'd rather do that first. But in a lot of these mega organizations, a lot of times they understand business architecture and they understand what their business capabilities are. So as a first pass, you kind of think, okay, well, I'm going to organize around business capabilities because I can create complete cross-functional teams around those. And I'm going to orchestrate the project work across, and I'm going to deal with dependencies across business capabilities. That kind of becomes like a first pass. And then like on a second pass, now we've got a bunch of teams formed around business capabilities. But the rub is going to be, and this is legitimate, that there's those dependencies left unchecked drive orchestration costs up really high. So because the orchestration is so high, it actually creates a business case for breaking dependencies. And then as you break dependencies, you can regroup business capabilities into value streams.
So it's almost like you're exposing the cost of dependencies and using that as a trigger or nudge to say, hey, this is costing you.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, because like you walk into organizations and the numbers, I can remember 20 years ago when I first, maybe a little longer than that, when I first got into project management, it seemed like if you were budgeting something like, and again, I'm making this up, it was like maybe 6 developers, 2 testers, a project manager, maybe split across a couple teams or something like that. And now it seems like you walk into places and like for every 1 developer, there's 2 testers and 3 project managers and a BA and like all this stuff, right? And it's like the complexity has gone up so much. We have all these people running around managing complexity. And part of the challenge that we've got is I think that's just a function of bad org design. Right. And unnecessary complexity. So like what starts to happen is that once you get the organizational design right, you're able to surface not only the dependencies, but the cost of managing those dependencies. And then what you can do is and I'm not saying that you have to lay people off, but it's like you can redeploy those people into other higher value functions within the organization. Rather than being scorekeepers. There's just too many scorekeepers around in most companies that we deal with.
Yeah. It is crazy. So like what you're saying is like almost, not almost, but I think it's exactly. So if your if your organizational structure policies is not aligned, that can cost you. That can almost like, a lot of times it's going to force you to fail, because that's a lot of times one of the underlying issues. Or impediments to having a more product value, whatever you want to call it, based organizational.
The other fascinating thing, and I literally just previous hour I was talking, we have kind of an emerging practice within our methodology group. It's kind of like the broad arc is methodology, and then we have kind of product and business architecture, and kind of within product, there's a specialty that's starting to emerge around finance and financial management. Because what we see a lot, and I know this will resonate with you, it's like as you start to build out, even if you're building out these little expeditions that are like team, program, portfolio, right, that kind of a thing, there's usually a layer, an audit and compliance type layer, governance layer that rides over all of this, that is still looking at 3 to 5 year plans and 18-month cycles and annual funding and all these different things. I think that is indeed an artifact of an organization that struggles to make and meet commitments, right? So they're planning and scorekeeping and doing all those things, even at the highest levels of the organization. And what's been pretty cool, and these are some big names that we're working with, is that once you get the organization performant, and it can make and meet commitments, and it can deliver in small batches, then the next trick is to go up a layer and say, okay, how can we exploit this new organizational capability so that we can make better bets in market, get faster feedback, and be able to learn from what it is we're doing. Because what my team was doing is they were pitching a white paper they wanted to do with us. And one of the things they were talking about was the idea that we've installed Agile, but we haven't really, and maybe we've even reduced costs and increased efficiency, but we haven't really maximized the product value or gotten to where we can actually put things in market and start selling them earlier. And again, that's an artifact of the way we're governing and doing audit and compliance and such is not congruent with the improved way that we're doing software delivery or product delivery in general, right? So what are the steps necessary to be able to bring those top level functions into alignment with this new deployment capability? And the way that you're going to maximize value at an enterprise level is to take your multi-year annual planning cycles and to break them into some sort of quarterly cadence with quarterly funding, right? To where you can fund a quarter or maybe 2, right? I'm not being super dogmatic. It's probably not continuous at that level. But I can fund a quarter release, and maybe by the end of the second quarter, realize that maybe I'm not quite on track, and maybe I have the opportunity to go correct something in quarter 2 or pivot into quarter 3. And I actually become more adaptive and agile at the senior most levels within the organization. And I think that's where that's again, in a mega organization with value streams that are global, like, I mean, sometimes that's where you've got to start attacking that.
That's really interesting. I'm also interested to hear your thoughts. How do you move from funding capabilities or cost centers to funding value streams? Like that also needs to happen at the highest level, and that needs that shift. What have you seen, and like that's working, that's not working in that shift?
Well, like I said, right? I mean, I'm dealing in a world where I have people that this is their specialty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that might be a topic for another podcast.
Yeah.
The vowels of it, right? But this is literally what we were just talking about, right?
Yeah.
They're hitting me with all this detail, right? And I'm like, well, really, like if you think about it, what we're really doing is we're trying to get them to break big projects into small projects and run the small projects on tighter cadences. Mm-hmm. They're like, yeah, that's exactly it. I'm like, okay, well then sometimes we just need to say that, right? You know, because that's all it is, right? So how do you get them to? Right. I mean, it all comes down to understanding what their constraints are and what they're trying to accomplish, and to be able to build a system that gives them what they need. As agilists sometimes, and this is the reason why we came up with this little quadrant model and our base camps and expeditions and things like that, is agilists, a lot of times what we want everything to be adaptive and emergent, and you know, it's just like, oh, we're just going to put things in the market really fast. Yeah, but if I'm building nuclear submarines, or I'm building cars, or I'm building missiles, or I'm building large scale financial services infrastructure, things like that, right? I mean, these are different than building websites or consumer products and things, and there's lots of things that have to come together in order for that to be able to happen. And so, like, one of the things that I talk about, and I've done this for a minute, like the earliest revs of our website say this right up at the top. It's like, most of the time, like, people aren't using, or they don't aspire to use Agile for like hyper adaptability and exploration. What they're really using Agile for is because they believe it will help them become more predictable. And that's why that tends to be the first step on the journey, is because when you organize complete cross-functional teams and you get them to establish stable velocity against a known backlog, and they get to a really clean definition of done at the end of every sprint, that is a much more reliable indicator of project progress than, you know, Gantt charts and progress reports and all that kind of stuff, right? And so what we can do is we can use Agile concepts to actually get to a place where we can make and meet commitments more effectively than our traditionally managed counterparts. Okay. And so now we have dedicated, stable, performant teams that we can count on that are aligned to business capabilities or value streams or products. I can start to think about how to fund those things in a more stable way. Right. And now this need for predictability and control isn't done by top-down edict and rules and tight governance and things. It's more like stable funding and periodic measurement of progress. And I believe in order to have that conversation at the most senior levels, the necessary precondition is to be able to actually be a performant organization.
I mean, you know, that reminds me of what you also described, like the almost the trust influence loop. Like, it's like, let's deliver first on what, you know, let's meet the organization where they are and meet them, you know, and it's almost like, in order to help them evolve, you're building that trust and you're delivering on what they want, and slowly.
Well, the very earliest thinkings of this is like, everybody I would, this is like, 15, 20 years ago, right? So like, everything I would hear would be like, oh, you have to trust the team, you have to trust the team, you have to trust the team. Well, the ecosystems that they're working in, their practices, their org design, like, nothing lends itself to trustworthiness, right? And so it's like, what I would tell people is like, you're asking these leaders to trust these teams, but these teams have no track record of ever delivering anything on time. Right. And I was talking with one prospect one time, and they're like, well, the executives need to stop asking us for dates. They need to stop giving us scope. They need to stop giving us budgets. They just need to just give us a big pile of money and just let us do whatever we want. And they didn't say it quite like that, but that's what they're saying. Right. And I'm like, okay, like, seriously, if you were building a house or doing whatever, would you just give the contractor $500,000 and just say, just go for it. Just build the best house you can. You're the guy that's closest to the ground. You know what kind of house I need. Like, no, right? You want to know what you're going to get for your money. And there's some reasonableness, right? There has to be some ability to deal with variation and respond to change, and there's change requests and things like that. But you want some idea what you're going to get for your money. Business owners are no different than that, or executives are no different than that. They want some reasonable controls to know that they're going to get pretty close. And so if you're going to go up to the most senior executives with some form of, you need to trust the teams, my belief is you got to get the teams trustworthy first. You have to create the organizational design. You have to create the process. You have to create the metrics. You have to get instantiated. You have to be able to put stable inputs in and get stable inputs out. Like, I mean, this is all Scrum basics from, like, I'm not saying, I don't think anything antithetical. Like, I mean, Schwaber was writing about this stuff in his earliest works about basically how to deal with variation and process control. Right? I mean, that was like early stage stuff. I mean, David Anderson's been writing about this in Kanban and has Agile management books. I mean,
that's the whole lean, like, in a sense, if you can manage the variance, you want to minimize the variance, but sometimes, right, it's not as easy as mass production plants and things like that.
Well, so where the trust influence loop came in, and so what we're talking about is that little figure 8 thing on the side. And it's been a while since I've talked about it, but like one of the things that we were talking about earlier is consultants. And I would say this is 100% true of internal change agents as well, is that there's an influence loop, which basically goes something from, like, you have access to somebody, you have to have empathy for their problem they're trying to solve. You have to have a point of view that actually they believe will solve their problem. And then you create safety for them. A lot of times what we do as Agilists is we come in and we say, we know your problem. This is what you need to do to fix it. And then they go, well, not quite my problem. And even if it is my problem, it's not the problem that has my pants on fire, right? So it's like, I'm not dealing with that right now. And so this whole influence game is a game of access, empathy, point of view, and safety, right? So you loop through that. And then on the backside, the trust side is you get permission to do something. You have to do it with integrity. You have to do it with competence, and you have to show results. Right. And so there's this virtuous cycle. And so this is the reason why part of what's up underneath, like, this base camp model, and the reason why we do incremental.
That's what I wanted to, maybe you can talk about that next, which how does the base camp and base camp expeditions, and how is it supported by that trust influence model?
So you think about it, especially from like a marketing perspective, a sales perspective, an early stage engagement perspective, to piloting and to rollout and to growing like a large account, and again, right, all this stuff, I'm a consultant, that's the world I live in, but even from a practitioner perspective, you're doing the same things, right? You're marketing, you're selling, you're getting started, you're scaling, right? All these things. And there's an influence game that has to be played, right? You have to tell a story that convinces somebody that this is worth doing. And then once you do it, you have to get the results you promised, right? So if I say, hey, you're going to get all this greatness from doing Agile, and I train everybody on Scrum, or I train everybody on Safe, and it ends up being a chaotic mess for 3 years, and you don't get the results, like, why would anybody continue to invest in that? Right? It's just a belief system at that point, right? And so what we recognized very early on was 2 things. And again, this is through the lens of a consultant running a consultancy, is if we didn't demonstrate tangible value really, really quickly, we didn't get to stay for very long. Right? Because no, seriously, right? Because
I'm laughing because I've been in many of those situations, and I know you're sure most coaches and consultants have.
Yeah. And it's like, you go in, everything's great. It's like, it takes a minute, 6 months, and you're like, yeah, okay, I can't get that next tranche of funding. It was great, man. Appreciate you. See you later. Right. Kind of a thing. Or maybe you have some success, but it's just like, it's just not mind blowing. Right. And so the evolution of these expeditions to base camps. And so just to put it into software language, like an expedition is like a slice. So I think of an expedition as like an increment of the organization. And a base camp is like an iteration. If you guys go back to, like, you think about like Jeff Patton's Mona Lisa metaphor, which I think is just brilliant, right? So he's using it to describe incremental and iterative, and he uses increments as like, okay, I'm going to take the Mona Lisa canvas, I'm going to split it into 6, I'm going to work on the upper left corner of it, right? That's an increment. An iteration is like taking it from like a sketch to a watercolor to an oil painting, kind of a thing. So we're making it more rich as we go. And so, like, we think of transformation incrementally and iteratively as well. So what we can promise typically in like a 3 to 4 month early stage engagement is we can take a slice of this organization, team level to portfolio, structure, governance, and metrics, all the practices, culture, all that stuff, and get it to a predictable state. And that's what we promise. And we can do that repeatably in 3 to 4 months. And then they go, oh, wow, this is actually really working. And then they go, okay, well, let's do the next chunk. And then they do the next chunk. And then do the next
What
chunk.
do you do in a sense, like when you're taking those vertical slices, there's almost like prerequisite to what they need to have in order to create that vertical slice, right? So there's some type of expectations that you set, if we're going to do this, this is what we need from organization to create that vertical slice.
Yeah. So remember I talked about system of delivery, system of transformation, system of engagement. So from a system of delivery perspective, you're building on patterns, reference architecture, filling in reference implementation details, things like that, right? So we have a hypothesis of what this is going to look like at Basecamp 1. And then we might have some idea of the first couple of slices. And then the system of transformation is all about how you run the expedition to Basecamp journey, right? So we have outcomes-based plans and a bunch of guidance that we've evolved over time, right? So we're going to move this slice into this known state. But on the system of engagement stuff, which I think gets to your question, is the way we do that is we'll get like all the leaders in a room and we'll walk through, here's the reference architecture, here's the things that you're going to have to do, here's the things you're going to have to overcome, here's going to be the nature of your dependencies, here's going to be your challenges. And are we 100% right? I think we got 80 or 90% of them. The details of the people and the particular architecture issues are all going to be all over the place. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the patterns, the failure patterns are fairly known, right? So we walk them through and we say, this is your failure patterns. This is what's going to happen. These are the things we need to fix. This is how we're going to go do it. So we start off with a workshop that brings everybody into a cognitive box. And then we expand that box into a bigger piece of the organization. And you can go for breadth or depth or whatever. I mean, there's lots of different strategies. And we do something called define the end state. It's usually about 2 months. And we've got that scripted out too. We look at business architecture, technology architecture, org design, product architecture, and literally create a team formation hypothesis. We put names in boxes. We help them figure out what tooling and instrumentation they're going to use. We help them figure out what they're going to measure, what they want to control, what success looks like, all those things. That takes a minute. And then what happens, then we create a plan for a pilot. And then we'll do a pilot. And then the pilot is going to work back to all of those core things we've been talking about all along. And they're going to see, okay, this pilot is going to go to Basecamp 1. And this is going to be the characteristics of the organization. They're going to be able to make me commitments. They're going to be able to deliver on quarterly boundaries. They're going to be able to do it in a reliable, predictable way. We're going to have dependencies managed. We're going to have economics trade-offs dealt with. We're going to get value, blah, 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 right? The risk in this early stage, right, is that you build the engine and you get really good at building the wrong product. I mean, that can happen, right? But so now you're in this dance of like, okay, well, if we focus on building the right product, but we don't have a delivery engine, is that better than building a delivery engine and not knowing what the right product is? Right. So as we've kind of advanced, there's a little bit of a dance, right? In an early stage, we might literally help them get better at building the wrong product. But now they have the ability to start to deliver on regular
the right product.
Right. And then as they start realizing, oh, okay, I'm getting data now, and I start to realize that we're building that, then that's when we might start introducing more product management practices. Or if we know we have dependencies that we need to do, like product extraction, technical decoupling, things like that, we might start bringing in some more like XP software craftsmanship coaches and start laying the foundations and building the capability internally so they know how to do red, green, and factor, things like that. And so we just layer these capabilities as we move them from predictability to smaller batches to fully encapsulated teams. And so that's how it works, right? And so
maybe just to pause on that, because I think, we can take it, lightly, like that's how it works. That's been my experience in a sense of how it works. But that takes a lot of effort on organization committing. The other big part that I would like to know from your perspective is how do you make it sustainable? So you bring coaches, consultants to help organizations realize this. And then eventually what you want them is, you want to work yourself out of the job so they can do this long term. What are some of the things that you do and some of the challenges that you face? Because I think long term, in order for organizations to be able to deal with same type of issues that they dealt when they brought you in?
Yeah. So the metaphor that I use, and this is, they're all systems metaphors, right? Is that leading Agile is like transformation in the cloud, right? And so in an early stage transformation, you might subscribe to our services, and we come in and we help you do all these things. But on any non-trivial size company, there's two dimensions you have to deal with. At some point, they want to take that in the cloud service. They might want to make it like an on-premise service kind of a thing. They might want to have their own instance of it, right? And so typically, lots of words, but typically the word we use most commonly is like, we'll set up like an Agile transformation office. And the Agile transformation office needs to have all the core services that Leading Agile has, right? So we'll help them identify a playbook. We'll get a coaching and development services, like a talent service, a way to manage the transformation, an expedition readiness service, right? All these different services that we've got that are in Leading Agile. We'll help our client build them, and then we'll teach them how to run it. And then, obviously we'd like to maintain a presence to help sustain it and nurture it and things like that. But what we've found, and I know you know this, there are not enough Agile coaches or technology coaches in this world to help the companies that need to be helped, right? And so I don't think there's any scarcity in this. And so, like, one of our longest standing clients, where we've invented a lot of this stuff with them, which has been a very cool relationship, is we built an Agile transformation office with them. It's their transformation office. They run it. And at one point in time, I want to say I had 45 consultants on the ground with them doing senior level transformation leadership, expedition leadership, we would call integration coaching, some specialists around product and finance and all those different things. But at one stage, they had 200, 250 coaches that were on the ground doing team level stuff that were sourced all over the place. They were sourced from other consultancies, internal people. And then over time, they started inserting their people in as expedition leads and transformation leads and things like that, right? As they started getting more confident in their ability to do it. And then now it just kind of ebbs and flows. Like if we're going into a gigantic company, right? So you do the first 13,000 people, and there's hundreds of thousands of people left to go, right? And so as we'll go in and we'll incubate another slice of the organization, and we might be at this for 10 years or something.
Exactly.
Like that, because they want to go. But what we're leaving behind the capability for them to sustain it themselves. Because we've instantiated the playbooks, and there's, so my belief.
Well, also you kind of essentiated the playbooks, but they're also you're developing the skills so they can develop and maintain and evolve those playbooks, right? And what's interesting is that I think, based on what you're describing, and that's why I wanted to talk to you, is like that's what it takes for organization to transform and to actually and if we look at the last 10 years and we look at Agile transformations, like 99% of them failed. So I'm interested, and that's a huge number. It's not like, most of the organizations that I've been part of, and the ones that have been part of that have been successful, is essentially what you're describing. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts, in a sense, like if that's what it takes for organization to succeed, and most organizations are not doing this. What are your thoughts? Like, what do we need to do as a community? What do we need to do as coaches? Because it's a big ask to do what you just described in here for organizations to be able to transform.
So here's the thing that I think is there's a couple of factors, right? So there's like a belief factor, and then there's like a pragmatic reality factor. And so like the belief factor, and this is the one thing I'm a little too extreme on this, and I'm going to acknowledge this. But it's like so many people in the Agile world, they lead with culture, and they say, well, it's a culture change, and we need to change mindset, and we need to change attitude, and we need to change the way people behave and stuff like that. And that's true, right? But the reality is that people are operating in broken systems. Okay. And unless we get the systems that they operate in right, and bring the process into congruence with the operating system, or the structure, you get it, right?
Mhm.
It's really difficult to ask people to change their minds. The way that I articulate is like I have two salespeople and they're both in the same region and I want them to cooperate, but I have them incented for you get paid based upon what you kill, I get paid based upon what I kill, but they want us to cooperate. I can't ask people to cooperate if our financial incentives are to compete.
Exactly.
Right? And so we have to create the ecosystem. We have to change the org design. We have to change the process to encourage the collaboration that we want.
Yeah.
So I think leading with culture, right? It's just, the way I typically say it. Leading with culture, I don't think is a winning strategy.
Yeah.
I think
it's almost like what Les Guy's saying, well, it's like, change the system, right?
Yeah.
And changing the system will force you to change, the culture as a result of that, the practices would change.
Yeah.
But here's the trick, right? Which I think is the biggest of them all. In order to do this, you have to have a leader with a mindset that is willing to change the system. And if you don't have that,
that's the chicken and the egg problem, right?
Yeah.
But I don't need to get them to change their entire leadership style. So like a little bit of the way that you flip that influence is you say, look, I get you have to make commitments. You have to be financially responsible. You have to be a good steward of the resources. You have fiduciary responsibility, your stakeholders, all these things. I'm going to build you a system. It's radically different than what you're doing today, but it's going to achieve better results. Are you willing to take a bet?
Yeah.
Right. The other side of it is like, and I've been in this world where there was a consultancy we were kind of partnered with 10, 11 years ago. And this lady goes in and she's like telling all the leaders, well, you need to change all your behaviors. You need to be more empowering. You need to do this. Like, and they were just like out, right? Because it's like, so it's like, you got to it's like the influence trust thing. You got to tell them the story they need to hear and then evolve their thinking.
Exactly. And I think that's what's so powerful. What I like when I first heard about base camps and expeditions, it's like, if somebody was asking me and saying like, Milan, you have to do this, I'll be like, go fuck yourself, right? But right? But like,
you can say that word on your podcast.
You can.
I'll be all down with it.
But because in a sense, that's not. But if they're actually walking me through, and I say, this is what I want to do, and they show me and they help me, and they say, okay, what do you like? It's easier for leaders to do that if they're going through that type of, and I think that idea of expeditions and base camps is.
Yeah, I had a colleague in the industry at an Agile conference a couple of years ago. There's a little bit of liquor involved. I'll acknowledge that, but we were having this very intense conversation. She's like, well, you need to empower and trust your people and just let them decide. And I'm like, but it's my money that pays their salary. If they jack up the account, I'm still paying their salary regardless of whether they're damaging their reputation and my economics and my family's livelihood and all these things. And so like a lot of it is like balancing between what's sufficient control to make sure that we don't lose the wheels on this thing versus empowering people to make local decisions. But getting back to the question that you had asked me about like what's getting in the way, I led with we're spending too much time on culture, right? I think that's still a big problem 20 years later. I think the other thing is you said, what do we need to do with the community? I think pragmatically, this is the challenge, is that most people, if they're independent or in a small company, they're trying to make a living and they're doing the best they can within the agency that they've been granted. So a lot of times they don't have the span of control. Sometimes they don't know how to go tell those executive stories. I mean, I probably half my team could not sit in a conference room with the C-level suite and tell those big stories, right?
Which goes back to that access. You can't influence if you can't.
Yeah, well, you don't get access if you can't influence, right? Yeah, for sure, right? So they tell a good story to a director or a VP, and maybe they make some good local changes, but they don't get the broad-based changes that they need. I mean, it's taken us 11 years to even get to the place where now, like, I think I've had a pretty strong story and market, but it's taken me 11 years. And I mean, there are more people that used to work for Leading Agile in this world than currently work for Leading Agile in this world. Our hypotheses on like, what are the right kinds of consultants and what do they need to know and what kind of org design do I put them in and what personality attributes do they need to have? I mean, like we've changed everything. We reinvent this company every 9 to 18 months. And it's constantly evolving to solve this problem. and we were fortunate that we had enough early success, and I was able to accumulate enough working capital that we could take chances and risks and build marketing teams and all these things to go out and tell these stories. But what I think, what the thing that I actually can't comprehend right now is why like the bigger consultancies don't deeply understand the story, because we, obviously almost anytime we go into an organization, there is a gigantic world-class strategy firm in there or something like that. And what I find is that the strategy firms are making the same mistakes as the small firms a lot of times. And so that's the thing that's a little mind-numbing to me, because they have business architecture practices, they have product extraction practices, they have the ability to do this stuff. So then I have to believe that it comes down to their beliefs about what to do it and what's in their economic advantage. So I think that there's some belief stuff, and I think there's some structural stuff that's getting in the way. But I feel very fortunate the way we built this company is that we generally get to do work on our terms and and so like what happens is we market and tell stories, and you've clearly read a lot of our content, and the companies that that resonates with, they call us. Yeah. Right. And our phones ring. I'm on 3 to 5 sales calls a week. I mean, we don't close everything, of course, right? I mean, just
but like you said, there's too much. There's like, in a sense, there's way too much work, and there's way too many companies that need the help. It's just that, like, that's what kind of puzzles me too, in a sense. Where are we gonna be? Like, in a sense that there's been this whole buzz around Agile, and it's really failed in a sense to really help organizations the way that the organizations need help. And it's the
reason I think we're still in the game, and I think there's still a conversation around it, is because I think organizations recognize that it's principally sound, and they believe that if they can crack the code, that it'll make them more successful, and they're right. But as a whole, we don't have good operating models for how to get there, and
or unified voice. As a community.
Well, I'll even say, and maybe this is, maybe somebody will get some nasty phone calls or emails as a result of saying this, is I actually think the Agile conferences are trending in the opposite direction. As I look at, like, I'm probably not even going to submit to Agile 22 this year, because I look at the tracks and I mean, these are important topics, but it's like a lot about it's diversity, equity, inclusion. It's about all these different things. And again, all important stuff, right? And I'm not diminishing that in the slightest, but I feel like the voice of, okay, transformation and business architecture and doing this in a structure, I don't think that's what people want to hear, right? And I think to some degree they want to deal with the easier issues. And this is tough, right? Because as an individual practitioner, it's tough to take what I say and go do it. Yeah. Because you almost have to, I mean, I hate to say it, it's self-serving, but it's like you almost have to hire us to do it, or you have to be like really deeply entrenched in it and like really understand it, and you might have a shot. But like I said,
well, that's almost like I use analogy with the cooks and recipes and chefs, right? Like,
it's a great thing,
you constantly have changing ingredients. So you can bring me in, if I'm a chef, you can bring me in to help you come up with the recipe. But what happens if you don't have the ingredients, the same ingredients, and I'm not there, and you're a cook that doesn't know what they're doing? You're gonna mess it up. So, like, in a sense, like, what we need is, like, how do we develop more chefs in organizations, and that they can actually deal with whatever is given to them. Architect based on context, not just, hey, here's a safe and we went to a 4-day training on safe or whatever, right? And I think
so here's like the interesting hard part, right? I've toyed with the idea of like building a certification or building a program or something like that. But you think about, Jim Cundiff works with me, and Jim was on the Scrum Alliance and was in the Scrum Alliance and really helped that organization make a lot of inroads into PMI, and really took it from kind of a niche and really kind of blew it up. And I think he would tell you directly, it's like people want to pay $1,200 or $800 now maybe, and get a 2-day certification, and they want it for their resume, right? And that's the market, and they want employment. And so, and I watched what the Scrum Alliance does with the advanced Scrum and things, and it gets traction to a point. But it's like, it's like the money is in selling easy. Like
Exactly. The money is selling recipes, not in training people on recipes, not creating chefs.
I used to get onto the marketing team at version 1 because they want to say in their marketing, Agile made easy. And I'm like, this isn't easy. It's really hard. Right. And then so I think they settled on Agile made easier or something like that. And I get it, right? Because it's like you need to sell an easy button, but it's not easy. You know, so I'm like, it's teams, backlogs, working, tested software. If you can figure that out, it's super easy. But getting the teams, backlogs, working, tested software has taken us 11 years to figure out how to do it. So, you know, and we're still figuring it out, right? I mean, I'll be the first to say it's like, I mean, I was telling the guys today, we're going to do a podcast and we're going to just talk about stuff that's just super exploratory because it's like, we don't have every answer. I think we've got the base patterns, right? And I think we have the principles, right? But the practices and the how-tos are constantly emerging as we learn more stuff. And we're talking to clients about using Agile to build the next rev of nuclear submarines and you know, battleships and things like that, and defense. Like, I mean, this is like cutting edge stuff that people want to use this for. So the industry still has pull, right? I mean, people want this. We just need more mature practitioners that understand how to apply these concepts in a less dogmatic way. So.
Exactly. And I think that's going to be the trick. I know it's been an hour and I feel like we could continue talking, but I do have to go back and I know I'm sure you do. Yeah, definitely. What would you like to end with? Like a message or invite or?
No, I think where we left it is pretty cool, right? I mean, if anybody's interested, I mean, obviously hit our website, leadingagile.com, connect with me on LinkedIn. We're super happy to answer questions and talk about this stuff. I mean, it's kind of what I do 4 or 5 hours a day is just field questions and talk to people, right? Whether it be my teams or clients or whatever. And super passionate about this. And if you're in the market and you're looking for a job, would love to have you reach out on our careers page. It seems like I got 20 or 25 open positions all the time. And so for the right people, it's a great place to be. And we're doing some really, really cool stuff. And I do believe we're on the cutting edge of a lot of this stuff. So hit our website and just check us out. And if it looks like a fit, either work together or to work here, we'd love to hear from you.